If your dog has ever walked up to you carrying something random in their mouth, a toy, a sock, or even something they weren't supposed to touch, and just dropped it at your feet while looking straight into your eyes, you've probably wondered what that really means, and more importantly, why they keep doing it. At first, it might seem like a simple habit or even something they learned accidentally, but this behavior is far more intentional than most people realize, and it reveals something surprisingly deep about how your dog sees you, how they communicate, and what they feel when they're around you. Because here's the truth most people miss. When your dog brings you something, they're not just giving you an object, they're expressing a state of mind, and in many cases, they're trying to fulfill a very specific emotional or instinctive need that you might not even notice. In the wild, dogs didn't have toys, but they did have roles, and one of the most important roles was carrying and delivering, whether it was food, objects, or signals to other members of the pack. And this instinct didn't disappear when dogs became domesticated. It simply adapted to a new environment where you became the center of their world. So when your dog brings you something, there's a high chance they're tapping into that ancient instinct, but instead of bringing something to a pack leader, they're bringing it to you, which already tells you something powerful about how they perceive your role in their life. But instinct alone doesn't explain everything, because not all dogs do this the same way, and not all objects are equal, which means there are layers to this behavior, layers that involve emotion, attention, trust, and even subtle forms of communication that most owners completely overlook. And once you start understanding those layers, something interesting happens. You stop seeing it as a random or cute habit, and you begin to recognize it as a kind of language, a way your dog speaks without words but with intention. Because sometimes they're inviting you to play, sometimes they're seeking comfort, and sometimes they're doing something much more meaningful that has nothing to do with the object itself, and everything to do with the bond they share with you. And the most fascinating part is this. Depending on how you respond in those small moments, you might be reinforcing behaviors, strengthening emotional connections, or unintentionally confusing them, all without realizing it. So before you dismiss it as just another quirky thing your dog does, it's worth asking a deeper question. What is your dog actually trying to tell you when they bring you things? Because the answer isn't just one thing, and once you understand it, you'll never look at that moment the same way again. To really understand why your dog brings you things, you need to go beyond what you see on the surface and look at the behavior through the lens of instinct, because a large part of what your dog does today is still shaped by patterns that existed long before they ever lived inside a home. Dogs are descendants of animals that survived by cooperating, and in that environment, carrying objects wasn't just a random action. It was a functional behavior tied to survival, coordination, and social structure within the group, which means that even today, this instinct hasn't disappeared, it has simply been redirected. When a dog picks something up and brings it to you, especially in a calm and deliberate way, there's often a trace of what's known as retrieval instinct, a natural drive that originally served purposes like transporting food or sharing resources within a pack. And while your dog isn't hunting anymore, that internal wiring is still active. But here's where it gets more interesting, because unlike wild behavior, your dog isn't just acting on instinct alone. They are combining instinct with learned experience, and that combination creates something much more complex than a simple reflex. Over time, your dog starts to associate bringing objects to you with outcomes. Maybe you responded with attention, maybe you spoke to them, maybe you smiled, maybe you played, and each of those reactions becomes part of a feedback loop that reinforces the behavior. In other words, what may have started as an instinctive action becomes a meaningful interaction, shaped by how you respond, and that's when the behavior shifts from being purely biological to something that carries intention and expectation. Some dogs will bring toys specifically because they've learned it leads to play, while others might bring random objects because they've learned that anything they carry toward you gets a reaction, even if that reaction is just you looking at them or saying their name. And from your dog's perspective, that reaction matters because attention, whether positive or neutral, still reinforces connection. And for a social animal like a dog, connection is everything. But instinct and reinforcement still don't explain why some dogs seem almost selective about what they bring, or why they choose specific moments to do it. And that's where emotion begins to enter the picture. Because sometimes what your dog is bringing you isn't about the object at all, it's about what that object represents in that specific moment. And once you understand that, you start to see that this behavior isn't just something your dog does. It's something your dog uses, almost like a tool, to communicate needs that go far beyond play or habit. Before we go deeper into that emotional layer, there's something important to keep in mind. If you've ever felt like your dog seems more connected to you during these moments, or more focused, or even slightly different in the way they approach you, that's not your imagination. And in the next step, you're going to understand exactly why that happens. If this kind of insight is helping you see your dog in a different way, it's worth staying connected to this kind of content, because the more you understand these subtle behaviors, the stronger and clearer your relationship with your dog becomes over time. Once you move past instinct and learned behavior, you begin to notice something that most people overlook completely, which is the emotional layer behind what your dog is doing. Because in many cases, the object they bring you is not the message itself, but a vehicle for something much deeper. Dogs don't communicate with language, but they do communicate with association, and objects can carry emotional weight depending on when, how, and why they are used, which means that what your dog brings you often reflects how they're feeling in that moment, not just what they want to do. For example, when your dog brings you their favorite toy, especially one they consistently choose over others, there's often a sense of shared experience attached to it, because that object has been part of previous moments of joy, play, and connection between you and them, and by bringing it to you, they are, in a way, trying to recreate that emotional state. It's not just let's play. It's more like, let's go back to something that made us feel connected. And that distinction matters because it shows that your dog is not only reacting to the present, but also referencing past experiences in a way that influences their current behavior, which is a clear sign of emotional memory at work. In other situations, your dog might bring you something softer, like a blanket, a piece of clothing, or an object that carries your scent. And this is where the behavior becomes even more revealing, because scent is one of the strongest emotional anchors in a dog's world. When they bring you something that smells like you, especially in moments when they seem calmer or more subdued, it can indicate a need for reassurance, closeness, or emotional grounding, as if they're using that object to bridge a feeling they can't express directly. And then there are moments when your dog brings you something completely random, something that doesn't seem to have any clear purpose or pattern, and yet they approach you with focus, sometimes even holding eye contact, waiting for a response. This is often where communication becomes the primary driver, because your dog has learned that bringing something is a reliable way to initiate interaction, regardless of what the object is, and in those cases, the object becomes secondary to the act itself. But here's the key point that changes how you see everything. Your dog is not just handing you things, they are offering you opportunities to respond, and through those responses, they are constantly learning what works, what gets your attention, and what strengthens the bond between you. Which means that every time this happens, there's a silent exchange taking place, one where your dog is testing, adjusting, and refining how they connect with you. And once you realize that, it becomes clear that your reaction is not neutral, it's part of the communication loop. So the question is no longer just why your dog brings you things, but what your response is teaching them every single time they do. And that's exactly where most people unknowingly shape this behavior in ways they don't expect. At this point, everything starts to shift from being about your dog's behavior to being about the interaction between both of you, because what many owners don't realize is that this moment, when your dog brings you something, is not complete until you respond, and your response is what gives that behavior its final meaning. From your dog's perspective, the action of bringing an object is only half of the equation, and what truly defines whether that behavior continues, intensifies, or changes over time is what happens immediately after, in that small window where they are watching you, reading you, and interpreting your reaction. If you respond with excitement, your tone of voice rises, your body becomes more animated, and suddenly that moment becomes charged with energy, which teaches your dog that bringing objects leads to high engagement, and over time, this can turn into a consistent invitation to play. If your response is softer, maybe you smile, maybe you pet them, maybe you acknowledge them calmly, then the behavior starts to take on a more emotional tone, one that is less about stimulation and more about connection, which can reinforce the idea that bringing something is a way to be close to you, not just to activate you. But there's another side to this that often goes unnoticed. If your dog brings you something and your response is inconsistent, sometimes engaged, sometimes distracted, sometimes even slightly irritated depending on what they brought, then the behavior can become unpredictable, not because your dog is confused in a simple way, but because they are trying to decode a pattern that isn't clear. And when patterns aren't clear, dogs tend to experiment more. They might bring different objects, approach you in different ways, or repeat the behavior more frequently, almost as if they are testing variations to understand what works best. And this is where some owners start to feel like their dog is being insistent or random, when in reality the dog is adapting to unclear feedback. There's also a subtle but important detail in how quickly you respond. If your dog brings something and you immediately react, the connection between action and outcome becomes very strong. But if there's a delay, even a few seconds where your attention is elsewhere, that connection weakens, and over time, this can influence how motivated your dog is to repeat the behavior. So in a way, these small interactions are constantly shaping a behavioral loop, one where your dog is not only expressing something, but also learning in real time how effective that expression is. And this leads to a deeper realization. Your dog is not just communicating with you, they are calibrating themselves around you, adjusting their behavior based on how you consistently respond in these micro moments that most people barely notice. Which means that whether you intend to or not, you are actively participating in the evolution of this behavior. And once you become aware of that, you gain something most dog owners never fully develop, which is the ability to respond with intention instead of habit. Now, before we move into the final step, there's one important decision to make, because how this message concludes will define the lasting impact it leaves. The next time your dog walks toward you carrying something in their mouth, whether it's their favorite toy, something unexpected, or even something they clearly weren't supposed to grab, there's a chance that what looks like a small, ordinary moment is actually something much more significant unfolding right in front of you. Because now, instead of seeing just the object, you begin to notice the context, the way they approach you, the pace of their steps, the focus in their eyes, and the timing of when they chose to do it, and all of those details start to form a kind of silent message that you can finally begin to understand. You might realize that they're not just asking you to throw the toy, but trying to recreate a moment of connection that mattered to them, or that they're not just holding a random object, but using it as a bridge to reach your attention in a way they've learned works. And in some moments, you may even notice something deeper, a sense that your dog isn't asking for anything specific at all, but simply choosing to come to you, to initiate contact, to share space, to engage in a way that feels natural to them, even if it doesn't always make sense at first glance. That's when the behavior stops being about training or habit or even instinct alone and starts becoming something relational, something that exists between you and your dog, shaped by every interaction you've ever had and every response you continue to give. And once you reach that point, something subtle but powerful changes. You stop reacting automatically, and you start responding with awareness. You might choose to engage, to reinforce, to redirect, or simply to acknowledge. But whatever you do, it's no longer random, it's intentional, and your dog, even without words, will feel that difference over time. Because for them, communication isn't about clarity in the way humans define it. It's about consistency, presence, and emotional feedback. And those are things you now have the ability to control in a much more conscious way. So the next time that moment happens, and your dog drops something at your feet and looks up at you, pause for just a second longer than you normally would. Look back at them, and instead of asking, "Why are they doing this?" ask something slightly different. What are they trying to share with me right now? Because in that question, and in how you choose to respond, is where the real connection begins to take shape, not in the object they brought, but in the meaning you decide to see.